Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us at the 72nd edition of the Winter Show. My name is Helen Allen. I'm the executive director of the show, and we are thrilled to have you with us today. I'm delighted to introduce our esteemed panelists for Price of Integrity, Collaboration in the Art Market, which we're running in collaboration with the Appraisers Association of America. When Linda and Jay and I first started talking about this a few months ago, we were really excited to get all these creative minds into one room and talk about all the myriad ways that different ends of the market work in collaboration in conjunction with one another. So I'm going to turn it over to our fabulous moderator, Alasdair Nichol, and then he will introduce. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, and thank you also again, Helen, for organizing such a fantastic winter show once again. And thank you, Linda, and my friends in the Appraisers, Jay and Molly as well, for putting this panel together. I thought it would be helpful if we all introduced each other first, so we know who we are. And I'll finish off with me, so I'll let you go first.
My name is Courtney Christensen. I am currently Senior Director of Trusts and Estates for Winston Artory Group. We are the largest independent appraisal and advisory and collection management firm. You could say I started my career, as a lot of people in our space have, which is as the daughter of collectors. So I've been coming to this show since I was very, very, very young. And my parents have started their collecting journey with Shaker Furniture and then moved on to Americana in all forms and sizes. My career choices were, if you can't beat them, join them. So I started at Sotheby's and was there. I was fortunate enough to work at the auction house for about 20 years, where I had lots of jobs. I was primarily an expert in fine art, prints and American art. And then I was head of Trust and Estates when I left in about 2017.
Great. So I'm Laura Doyle. I am the Fine Art and Collections Manager at CHUBB Insurance. We insure bespoke property, including all types of collections. I'm responsible for strategy, working directly with collectors and their advisors to put together insurance programs and collection management programs. Way back when, I had gone through the Appraisers Association program at NYU, so I do have some training in appraisal. Have not kept up with my USPAP, but something I can revisit. But it's great to be here.
I'm Arlie Sulka. I'm owner of Lillian Nassau, LLC. My firm was founded by Lillian Nassau in 1945, and she is credited with having revived the interest in the work of Louis Comfort Tiffany and Tiffany Studios. I began my career at a very, very small auction house where the person who ran it was insane. And but if I could work for and if I could work for this person, I could do anything. The attrition level at the auction house was very rapid, and mainly because he often fired people for just looking at him sideways, or you got a better job. And I was one of those people who got a better job when I met Lillian Nassau at the auction house, and she asked me to come work for her. And little did I know that I would never leave. I have been there since January 2nd, 1980, and in 2006, I acquired the business from the family.
I'm David Walker. I'm a certified appraiser at the AAA. I'm also the founder of Walker Decorative Arts, which is a company specializing in objects from all over the world, English, European, Southeast Asian, etc. I've spent 14 years in the auction business at Bonham's, Freeman's, and Sotheby's, and I set up on my own in about 2019. I've also been a featured appraiser on Antiques Roadshow since 2011. So,
thanks, everyone. And I'm Alasdair Nichol, the moderator for today. My background was somewhat different to the rest of you because I went to art school in Aberdeen in Scotland. I'm originally from Edinburgh, did my master's in Belfast, and then when I came back to Edinburgh, was surprised to learn that people didn't hire painters, so I needed a job. And I ended up as a porter at Phillips Auction House in Edinburgh, mainly in antiques, but that's back when they were selling fur coats and everything else, so I'm showing my age. And from there I moved to Phillips in Glasgow, where I started the fine art department, did sales of Scottish contemporary art. They moved me down to London to do modern impressionism, And in the wisdom, they brought me over to the United States, where I'd never been before, to do fine art here and run the department. And that was in '97. I then joined Freeman's, where I was chairman for 6 years. December 31st was my last day there, so that was 26 years at Freeman's, 40 years altogether in the auction business. And now, to complete the circle, I've taken a studio in Long Island City, and I'm going back to painting and printmaking, my first love. So, looking forward to that.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
That's awesome.
And I'm also a proud member and second vice president of the Appraisers Association. I've been involved with it for many, many years. Sylvia Leonard-Wolfe, who many of you may know, introduced it to, the association to me, and I did a talk for them back in the 90s, I think. So, big fan of Linda. She's done an amazing job for them, and very proud to be involved. So, most of my time, there was 40 years, as I say, as an auction professional, and I know it's a bit of a cliche now, but we're told that the industry depends on the 3 Ds, death, debt, and divorce. I would add to that, these days we've also got downsizing and donations. Now, each of these brings with it its own set of challenges and nuances and whatnot, and each requires a different type of appraisal. And so, who am I going to throw this one at? Why not you, Courtney? Do you want to tell us a little bit about the kind of appraisals for each of those areas?
Sure, and then if I get anything wrong, you guys can all jump in. There are, in fact, many nuances to the values that are used for appraisals, and they are driven by the purpose of the appraisal. So one of the most common that Laura knows intimately is the appraisal for, or the appraisal value for insurance. That's a retail replacement value. It is, as we think about the range of value for every object that is out there, and that is a range, that is not a naughty thing to think about something having a lower value or a higher value. The insurance appraisal value can often be at the highest level because the concept is you've lost this object or your work of art, you need to replace it immediately. You are obviously going to be going out into the retail marketplace, most likely not waiting for an auction scenario, and you're probably going to be paying a premium. So that's at your highest value. You then come to the more middle of the range is fair market value, technically, and this is not true for every single market, but fair market value is used for estate tax, for donation appraisals, if you are donating anything for and you know, hoping for some sort of tax benefit. Fair market value can also be used for equitable distribution, but then there are also instances in which people do choose different values for that purpose. After fair market value, we then also have marketable cash value. Marketable cash value is when you think about a fair market value, what something would bring if it were on in a competitive bidding scenario or competitive marketplace, and you actually take out the premiums that would be paid and any other really significant costs. Insurance, if you're getting it somewhere other than Laura, where, you know, because they charge the most competitive rates. Any other insurance costs, any installation costs, anything that's really tied to the overhead of owning that object. So that's your marketable cash value. There are then some actually other values out there. There's rental value. There are different scenarios in which people require values. Again, like I was saying, for litigation purposes or oftentimes in a divorce or marital situation, you can have people use either a marketable cash value or a fair market value. The reason that we think about all of these things, and we wanted to make sure we started our talk with this, is that very few people, I think the most common mistake we see as we were talking about preparing for this, is that people oftentimes think that these values are interchangeable and that they will be looking at, I literally had a conversation yesterday with a gentleman who's in an estate situation, and he was looking at a 20-year-old appraisal for retail replacement value. And that is apples to oranges in terms of what he was looking at.
Question we get more than any other than when's my brown furniture going to go back up in value again, is what's the difference between, because an appraiser will, when you do it because you're a dealer, you'll say, in a retail scenario, I would charge this. Whereas David or I, because we had auction background, we say, well, at auction, we would expect this. What's the difference?
The problem today is that in some cases, auction prices can exceed our retail prices.
Yeah.
And that is, I think that makes it a little more difficult when you're doing an appraisal. But when I'm on the set and I'm valuing something, I am absolutely thinking about what I can sell it for in the gallery. But who's to say 6 months later it comes up at a major auction house and it goes for more than I say? Well, it's just, that was that day, you know? And I always, when I see that happening, I have to say, well, there are two ways to look at this. When this used to happen, when Lillian was in the business, after an auction, she'd walk into the gallery and she'd say, I made a lot of money today. And then she would raise all the prices. And it's like, and she goes, and I didn't buy anything. For us, I always say, where are those people? Why aren't they coming into the gallery? But we do adjust our prices based on what happens in the auction world, but it doesn't mean that they're going to be more. So that makes it confusing for all appraisers.
When it comes to something like Tiffany, obviously Lillian Nassau is one of the great anchor points for the market there. And I think when we're doing appraisals for these sorts of things, we look at where the objects are most commonly traded. And so at auction, that's another very valid market for Tiffany, and a lot of the collectors that may go to you, correct me if I'm wrong, might also transact there as well. So when you're looking at a retail replacement value, you can sometimes use an auction value as a retail replacement value, when traditionally you would look at an auction value as being somewhere where a dealer would buy and then mark up for, and it still exists a lot in the things that I trade in, and then mark up for their own retail business. So an auction value doesn't necessarily just mean it's going to be less than a retail value in every instance.
I'll just add really quickly, this is where what we do, I think, is the most interesting, because we do start every approach to value with a what is the most common marketplace. Right. It was something that got very confusing, actually, as markets get very frothy. If there's a lot of speculation, and this was particularly acute in, believe it or not, in the pandemic, when there was an immediate shutdown and all the prices went off a cliff, but then there was this unbelievable upswing surge of interest. And a lot of it was speculative, and it was in very specific markets. In the contemporary area, it was for emerging artists, BIPOC artists that people believed were undervalued. And then we were also seeing it, for instance, in watches, right? There was an absolute, everybody was stuck at home, and apparently everybody wanted a new watch. And what happens when that demand surges so dramatically is that you inevitably have a supply problem. And when you're dealing with something like a watch that has a very established retail market, but also a secondary market, that's where you can see that inversion, because there were watches in the pandemic that were retailing for $25,000 that nobody could get. And so they were selling at auction for $425,000. And then we had our trusted partners in the insurance space calling us, or actually what it really was a lot of the heads of family offices for celebrities who also own these watches were calling us and saying, well, where does our insurance value need to be if technically you would go into a retail space to buy this, but you can't get it, so you're waiting for an auction, and then suddenly it's this crazy price.
Right. Yeah, no, I was just going to add, so from an insurance perspective, all of those market segments that you just mentioned, and then sports memorabilia. So we had clients that had bought something, by Anna Wayan or Christina Quarles, one of the ultra contemporary artists, 6-12 months before, and then those pieces were appraising for multiples of that. So those markets just skyrocketed. And then sports memorabilia, everything that's been happening in that space. I think it was the Michael Jordan Netflix show Last Dance that came out, and then there was a huge sale at Sotheby's, and then after that, all of our clients that had the sports memorabilia that they had never insured before, they started getting appraisals done. And it's something that's really at the intersection of, passion and investment, and I think it just brought a lot of awareness to different categories during that time.
Laura, do you recommend, because of the ever-evolving market shifts and things going up and bubbles happening and then markets collapsing a little bit afterwards and so forth, do you recommend people do revisit their insurance appraisals on a timely basis? Like, how often do you ask them do you suggest that they do it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So appraisals, first of all, are critical to the insurance space, right? I mean, the appraisal is needed to establish the limit at which you're insuring your items. So you're either structuring your fine art insurance policy on an itemized basis where you've got individual description of items and the values that are based on that appraisal, or you're looking at an aggregate value for a collection and buying a blanket limit of coverage. But some market segments are way more dynamic than others. So we have some clients, especially those that might be more investment focused, that are getting updated appraisals done annually for certain segments. Contemporary at that time, ultra contemporary before that market cooled. But, 3 to 5 years is a general rule of thumb. Certain segments aren't as active, and
Mine
I'm not going to
possibly,
call it
yeah.
out. Yeah, your area, in terms of the values. And so we see that, some markets can wait longer before the reappraisal, but it's just a piece of risk management. And so you want to get that updated appraisal done on a regular basis and then update the insurance schedule to stay in line so that if there is a loss, I think we can add damage to the list of Ds that you mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah.
So that if there is a loss, we know that they're being compensated to acquire something of like kind and quality.
Something that's happened a lot with us, most of our clients, when they purchase a lamp over a certain amount of money, just hand off their invoices to CHUBB in particular. And that sufficed as an insurance appraisal for the time being. But then
Yes.
3 years later, did you say?
Yes.
Okay. 3 years later, the client's coming back and says, oh, they're asking me for an updated insurance appraisal. And I often say, it hasn't, sadly, I've had to say it hasn't changed. But does CHUBB still require an updated appraisal if there is no change?
If it hasn't changed, no, not necessarily. So we can use an invoice at the beginning to schedule the item. We just need something that establishes what is the current market value for a piece. Unless you got a great deal on it, theoretically, whatever you just paid should be the replacement value. And then going forward, we would look for an update. But if the market's flat, generally that can, we can get a communication on that front. We try to be more targeted with where we're looking for reappraisals. So we're really trying to narrow in on specific artists, specific market segments, and that's where the focus is on reappraisals.
And is there an amount where you start looking for an appraisal? I know with some clients, if it's $250,000 and above, they usually are looking for a new appraisal.
So it depends on what the item is. Jewelry and watches, we usually start at $100,000. For fine and decorative arts, we're now at $500,000, just where the market has changed. But you need something to establish value up front. So even below that threshold, many of our clients will get appraisals done. And unless they're closely following the market, they need some kind of indication.
So the theme today is the price of integrity. Just to give you a bit of context, when I worked in the UK and I was working at I worked with an auction house. Now, with most of the auction houses in the UK, you're an auction house, but you also did appraisals. And so we would go out and we would do an appraisal, and it might be, 500,000, a million or whatever, and we would charge a percentage of that appraisal as our fee. And quite often they would say, well, that's quite a lot of money, but I was looking at the appraisal and I noticed that this painting is worth considerably more than I thought it was. And of course, that was our opportunity to say, well, if you want to sell it, and that will help you pay your fee. So it was a win-win game as far as an auction house. When I came to the United States, very different approach. And I was told that, my card, which said auctioneers and appraisers, was non-USPAT compliant. I learned quickly. And then I learned about the Appraisers Association and how important having an independent appraisal is. So we've seen the growth of appraisals. And actually, I was going to ask, and I forgot to do this beforehand, because we all introduced ourselves, but we don't know who you are. So don't worry, I'm not going to go around the whole room and ask you what your name is, et cetera, et cetera. But out of interest, how many of you have actually had to have appraisals done? Okay, that's a few. And how many here are appraisers? A lot. And advisors? A lot too. I told you that was going to be... So we have an informed audience, I think it's fair to say. But what I'm trying to get to is, when I came to the States, obviously these old rules were not going to play. You needed somebody independent to come in and appraise your artwork, not have an interest in it, which as auction houses we certainly did. So I wanted to go along and hear from you guys what sort of conflicts you've come up against over the years in terms of, because basically this is about ethics, isn't it? Yep. and the methodology that you use. So have you had any ethical conundrums, or can you speak of it? You mentioned one before, I think, wasn't it? There was a big case, wasn't there?
Yeah, well, yes. I feel like I have them more and more these days. It's funny you say what price integrity. I have to remember what the value of mine was when I transacted it. I don't recall, but the IRS would say whatever that price was. Whenever I sold my integrity is what it's worth. So for those of you in the audience who are not, I feel like we are sort of loosely using USPAP. For those of you who are not in the audience and not aware of what that is, it is not just the world's worst acronym ever. It is the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, and it is the code of ethics and standards that are approved by Congress that are it is borrowed from the real estate world, so it is not perfect for what we call tangible personal property, but it is the best standard that exists, and so that's why we all, or most of us, we're going to get everybody back on USPAP on this panel. So I would say, and I should say this as a recovering auction house person, I would say that part of my road to Damascus to working for an independent company was in fact driven by the inherent conflicts of interest of preparing appraisals while being part of a machine that is built to transact property. And I want to say, first and foremost, this is with enormous amounts of respect for my friends and colleagues who are still with the auction houses. They are perfect for transactional moments. There is nothing better than the closing mechanism of that moment, that auction moment, which most of us know really well on this stage. For, a great transactional moment, it is not always the best set of conditions for determining the actual value of something. And that's because it's motivated by the appraisal companies at the auction houses, are motivated by an interest in knowing what is out there, establishing a relationship with clients, and hoping that that relationship eventually leads to a transaction. So that doesn't necessarily position the expert, all of whom are brilliant and very, very good at what they do. That doesn't put them in the best set of circumstances for putting an independent, accurate value on something. So I can tell a number of horror stories that were born out of auction scenarios where we were acting as the appraisers, for instance, as I most commonly do for estate situations. And because the in-house appraiser did not want to pass on bad news, they said that this particular type of, piece of furniture, which they suspected was very married and very much made up of disparate parts, was possibly $1 million. And the problem in an estate context that happens is that the estate then goes to pay tax on $1 million. The family then eventually goes to sell the piece, and that's when the truth oftentimes slowly comes out. This one particular piece of furniture that I'm thinking about eventually sold at a regional auction house for $25,000. So that was obviously a dramatic example, but it is one of the things that has come to the forefront, I feel like, in the many years that I've been doing this, is an increasing awareness that you are best served by somebody who is independent in the space and really engaged. And while we all do wear multiple hats, and I know there are a lot of people in the audience who do as well, we are very, very capable of saying, I'm here to do an appraisal, and my job is to identify the best market and to be as accurate as possible about the piece, and to be working as diligently as possible to get the number right. And I think that's one thing, again, that we see clients getting caught in is either, relying on an outdated appraisal, relying on an appraisal that's for a different value than the purpose that they're being driven, but also maybe not being fully inquisitive themselves of what is the role of this person who's giving me the appraisal, what is their ultimate goal, and how might that affect the product.
So continuing with that theme of independence, several years ago, we had a client that had acquired a large collection of Fabergé, and he had always bought from the same dealer over a number of years. He had never insured these pieces. Eventually, it got to the point where the collection, the purchase price was in the multi-millions. And so he decided he wanted to add them to his insurance policy. And we asked that he have an independent appraisal done, not the dealer that had sold him all of the pieces. So we had an appraiser that flew down to his home in the Southeast. And The appraiser said the moment that he walked in, he looked at all the pieces and knew immediately they were all fake. So we
call that Fabergé.
Fabergé. So, I mean, it was horrible for this client, right? He had trust in the dealer. He had a lot of passion in the area, and it was a difficult message, I think, for that appraiser to deliver. But he wouldn't have known had he not had that independent source come in to do that appraisal. So at that point, it was, we don't know how that ended between him and the dealer, but it's just, I think as part of your due diligence, making sure that you have some independent assessment of a collection over time, especially when you're collecting in one funnel and from one individual, is really critical. So.
That said, all of the appraisals that we do, there is a caveat in them that say that this is not a guarantee of authenticity. And so, it's a very, very difficult area, isn't it? If you're an appraiser, obviously you're a specialist appraiser in a certain area and you know your market and your objects extremely well. But when you're coming, you're triangulating that, and you're coming into a situation where it could get extremely litigious. It's a very, very hard line to tread, I'm sure. Yeah.
But that's why it's so important that people hold on to the receipts, or they have the labels and whatnot, because so often you'll go in, you'll see a painting, and it'll be a painting that really you need to send to Paris or London or to an expert to have it authenticated, because we can't do that. So as you say, David, you have to put that caveat in. But I love when you go into a house and you say, well, we've got all the receipts and there's a whole binder with
The
all
binder.
that stuff.
Yes.
It's fabulous.
Give it to me. Yeah.
Better than sticky notes.
But you can't insure against authenticity. So if you think something is a Picasso, it's not. It's a change in attribution. There's no damage. There's no loss. So it's a financial loss at that point, but no insurance coverage.
Interesting.
And, for us, we've been in situations where actually when eBay started out in the late 1990s, roughly early 2000s, and an established client of ours bought a lamp on eBay and went to an auction house and said, could you authenticate this for me? And they said no, and they recommended someone to write an appraisal, and they wrote the appraisal, they took the money, and then my client, I guess, had a funny feeling, and he came to me, and it was what I call an across the street lamp. It's like, I'll know it's fake from across the street. So I helped him out. I knew where the seller was located, and I also had a very good friend and client who was from that area, and put him in touch with a lawyer who actually had already sued the person who had sold the lamp.
Wow.
And he was able to get his money back. But it was frustrating to me that that particular appraiser had taken the money and said, this is real, or this is what it's worth. Probably should have done some due diligence. Probably should have called us.
Without the proper qualifications.
Right,
They hadn't educated themselves. I mean, we often refer things to other people for second opinions and things, don't you? I mean,
100%.
a lot of the time it's by committee.
100%. And I think that people are much more, do their due diligence much more now, because we're contacted a lot. But I have to see what I'm looking at, if I'm helping. It's really important, because I'd hate for someone to be paying for an insurance premium on something that's fake.
Yeah. Well, I was only going to say that I think, and again, this is because I do have this role in the trust and estate space, I spend an enormous amount of my day talking to lawyers and bankers and people who come from very regulated industries. And I will be one of the first people to say that I think this myth of the unregulated auction house is hyperbole, of the unregulated auction art and antique market is hyperbolic, and that in fact the market regulates itself fairly well, but it is one of the first points of translation that I am usually trying to say to people in other very regulated industries, that they kind of can't fathom that someone can in fact very easily call themselves an appraiser, even though they may not have any affiliation with an association, or they may not have USPAP, qualifications. There is no appraisal jail. There are some hefty IRS penalties, but there isn't anybody out there, taking these people off the streets. And one thing that we see quite frequently in at our company and we've been seeing this more and more in the collateral loan space, where people are using objects to, as collateral for loans from large financial institutions, both recourse and non-recourse loans. And we see these absolutely insane appraisals come across our desks where people are saying, I've had this object appraise this masterpiece by an artist who's never sold anything on the primary or secondary markets, but it's a masterpiece and it's worth $1 million. And I've been getting a loan from this bank, based on this. And the only thing I can say is my one rule of thumb is if the appraiser's CV is 3 to 5 times the length of the actual appraisal, that's your first red flag. Seems to be consistent across the space. But people would probably be shocked by the number of people who are out there presenting themselves as qualified. And it may be as innocent as, I am preparing this appraisal for a work of contemporary art, but my real area of expertise is silver. Sometimes that's, not great, a little bit more innocent. But that is one of the things that we try to, I think, and that the industry is doing a much better job of getting people to go through accredited organizations and to look at people more critically in terms of their qualifications.
It's interesting. I have the same feeling because the minute you see an appraisal and it's about that thick and it's for one painting,
For one object.
uh-oh.
Yes.
And it's beautifully written. It registers every spot of fly dirt on the back to the center. Everything's great except the price at the end, which is totally wrong. And it's a bit like the Antiques Roadshow. We always know that if somebody wheels up this huge crate and it's got lots of nuts and bolts and da-da-da-da-da, it's always going to be, this is a Leonardo, this is a Michelangelo. Sadly, they never are, but the more there is to it, the less chance it's going to be. But we're talking about fake things that people find out after they bought them. Again, using the Roadshow as an example, everybody loves those ones where, and how much did you pay for it? Oh, it was $10, it was $20. What's it worth now? $20,000. And I always think everybody loves that, except possibly the person who owned it and is looking at it thinking, what on earth was I doing selling that for $10? And we see that quite a lot. I had dinner last night with a friend who's a London dealer, and he just bought a painting from the States. And he bought it for $400, I think, and it had trash written on the back. So the person was actually throwing it out and ended up in a place. He knows exactly who the artist is, and he's now charging $40,000 for it. It's the same story with, and I can use his name, Cliff Shorer, whom some of you may know, with Agnews. And this was a whole story in Vanity Fair about a Dürer drawing that was found and was going for next to nothing. The current asking price for it now is $32 million. So it goes both ways. So you really need to have a proper appraiser look at what you have, or for your clients, see what they have in the house. And what we all came to is the expertise issue, I think, because it's knowing the backstories. It's knowing why that painting made that much. Again, I won't hog the mic too much, but we had a NC Wyeth. It was a main landscape. It was in at 150 to 250,000. I was the auctioneer. I got up in the rostrum. There was a left bid of 2 million. And I thought, heavens, there must be something wrong here. The frustrating thing, well, it wasn't frustrating. It made 2 million. On the nose, and I had another phone bidder. I couldn't enjoy the moment because I was convinced that the person who left the bid was also on the phone. That wasn't the case. What had happened was you had two people who both wanted a main landscape. And I spoke to the chap who was on the phone, and his client had told him to go up to 700,000, but when it came to him, he kept going on and on and on until it made 2 million. The lady who bought it, I can say it was Linda Bean, LL Bean, because she passed away shortly after that. And it came up at auction, Bonhams, I think, and it was in at 600 to 800,000. They couldn't get a bid on it because the two people who wanted it were both out of the market. Now, anybody else who had it would think, oh, I've got a painting like that, it's worth 2 million. That's not how it works. And that's where the expertise and having the background knowledge to these things, I think, is so important. Sorry, I went off on a bit of a rant there.
No, but I think it's an important point, and it is, again, when you're in the market and you are a client who's receiving an appraisal, it's important to know, did the appraiser just look at auction results? Because that is another sort of reflexive way to generate a value. It's just look, there's so many databases now, they're out there, look at them all, and sort of grab a number and do some loose math and come up with a value. You do need to really understand and think critically. First of all, is this your best marketplace? And if it's not, you need to be going into the retail space, and that means you need to have an active network of people you can call. I mean, we are so relentlessly grateful for the contacts we have in the retail space and the dealers who are so generous with their knowledge, because you do need to know, oh yeah, well, I was asking this, but I really sold it for this. Or if something sold, but it sold to a museum, maybe, it sold a little bit undervalued because getting it into the museum was important. So understanding the context of all those values is critical, and who the audience is. I was telling Alasdair, I was in a bit of a back and forth with the IRS over the value of something, a work of American art that had depreciated in value as the market for American art has adjusted from the early 2000s. I know some of us are still in trauma over that, myself included. But I finally got so fed up, I literally made a list of all the major American art collectors who had passed away since the work had originally been bought, and, and where the date of death value was now, to just say, like, look, this is a different audience and the people who were supporting those values.
I thought you were going to tell us your watch story there.
My watch story. I have a lot of watch stories.
What about the one about the
Julie.
Chinese paintings? Wasn't that a good
Oh,
one?
yes, the Chinese painting. Well, that's a really interesting case. Again, if anybody isn't able to sleep at night, there's an amazing tax court case that recently came up involving the Metropolitan Museum, where a trustee of the museum used an auction house in China for the appraisal, for the donation appraisal. He was gifting a bunch of things to the institution. And they've been, and again, just to show you how long these things go, this was a gift that was done in 2012, I believe. And the decision from the IRS, the tax court decision, only came out last year. So these things drag on. And that was with a fully funded, active IRS. So we are now, I'm assuming now those those timelines are only going to push out. After Sotheby's and Christie's, it was globally the third most successful auction house in the world. The problem was what was slowly starting to come out at that time was that the auction houses in China were falsifying their own results. So they were either buying things themselves if something was not going to perform well at auction, and then they were doing other sort of fancy things around values. And the IRS had started to get very skeptical about any appraiser using comparables from those auction houses, from those auctions, as support for their value. And that's again, it's a fact for those of you who like art and value and taxes. It's a good read.
David, I thought it was interesting you brought up, and I think it's a part of our conversation for all of us these days, the AI and these apps that seem to be turning up where you just hold it up and it tells you how much your silver is worth or your decanter is worth. Not knocking, I'm sure in time will be great, but I think there's a lot of things to be concerned about there.
It's very interesting. I mean, on my Instagram, I constantly get advertisements for a particular app, as you say, that's marketing itself as a valuation app. So it just, and it has as part of the ad like a reel of like it in action. So zooming in on a chair, like one of these ballroom chairs, it's like $350, or a silver plate teapot that's worth like $30. It was a $3,000, and I'm thinking your advertising for it is wrong. Like the values are completely incorrect. And also, why would you even have an app that does that or try and charge people when most people now are using Google Lens to look up their stuff if they don't, have an idea of value or know what it is? So, yeah, I think these are going to be very, very difficult and dangerous to the market. I mean, I use Google Lens when I'm doing appraisals. There's no shame in it. I think it's a very useful tool, especially if you want to find a particular title for a print, for example. You can find the title or whatever it is. But in doing it, I'm getting all of these crazy things. And if you zoom in on different sections of the image, you'll get a completely different response. So if you do an overall of the cabinet, it'll say, this is an English aesthetic movement cabinet, ebonized. You're like, okay, that's sort of what it is. And if you just do the section at the bottom, like, this is a Korean storage box from the Joseon period, you're like, completely different. And the thing is, AI tells you as if it's like 100% fact. So this is what it is. And so I'm getting a lot of people who are contacting me and saying, I know exactly what this is, and I know exactly, therefore, what it's worth. I'm like, well, it isn't that at all. So I think a lot of the auction companies as well invested, I don't know if they're continuing to do this, but were investing a tremendous amount of money in these AI tools to try and get these valuation things going, to try and mean that essentially nuance and specialism and, and everything else isn't actually necessary. But it's in a sense, it's more complicated now and worse than it's ever been, with all of that effort that they're putting in. So I don't really know where they are with it now, but yeah, you have to be extremely careful.
Well, I noticed even because I'd written out notes about what we might discuss today, and I put in RRV, and the AI came up with relational retail value, and I thought, well, there's still room for us, obviously.
I think what's happening right now is that there are just apps or things that exist that are just AI, that are stripped of any expertise. And there's also then just pure expertise without any of the efficiencies and things that AI, I mean, there are some moments where AI actually can, I think, improve what we do, at least from a speed perspective. And I know one of my favorite lunches I ever did was one of the big banks, the head of insurance services for their most high net worth clients. I was paying for lunch, and we were having this whole conversation, and he just looked at me and said, "So when is a robot going to be able to do what you can do?" And I was like, well, I mean, enjoy your lunch, I guess. Very blunt. Ultimately, one of the things that's very real about appraisal practice is that it is slow and cumbersome, and it is, and that is where the cost comes in, and that's why people try to survive with 20-year outdated appraisals, because it's expensive and it's time consuming. So I do think that there is perhaps a happy road forward that involves a collaboration between AI and data, but that it's layered with expertise, because you cannot look at the results from anything AI generated, without an understanding of the marketplace.
When it comes to three-dimensional objects, I will
Yeah.
stick my hand up. This is probably a fatal thing for me to say, but I think that AI will never be able to do it.
For three-dimensional, I think that's actually
Because
accurate,
if you think about a beautiful Georgian chest of drawers attributed to Thomas Chippendale, and it will find that, it will say, look at the carving, that's what it looks like, so forth, but it can't see through the doors. It won't know if the entire back's been replaced. And also, if you think about chemical analysis, XRF machines and so on, that are really moving technology forward in identifying things and dating things like that. Like, these are very, very specialized tools, and a simple camera is never going to be able to come up with that. It's not going to know if a piece of timber was felled 700 years ago or not. I don't think it's ever going to be able to do it personally.
And I think
Disagree.
that's fair.
You disagree?
Holograms.
Holograms.
I think when they get better and better, it's going to be like having the actual object in front of you.
Well,
I put it to you.
I mean, I guess if you scan it in a certain way and it has like a three-dimensional, whatever inside, then I guess it's possible. But
David,
I
be
still don't
excited.
think,
By the time we can afford that technology, it means the English furniture market has come back.
it will come back. Yeah. No, I don't know. I personally don't think it's ever going to be able to do it. You're always going to need to have a person to monitor.
yeah.
I think
You always need a person.
I'll use the example and then we'll move on to questions. But I remember doing an appraisal in Glasgow, and it was one painting, and I went and took a look at it. I spent some time looking at it. We left, we sent off the bill. The person was outraged. They said, "How dare you charge me this? You just came to my house. You were there for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. We actually had a very nice chat, etc." They were outraged by this. And I had to basically say, you're not just paying for 15 minutes. It's very like the whole Whistler thing when he ended up in court with Ruskin. He said, "You're just throwing paint." He says, "Yes, but it took a lifetime for me to be able to do that." And that's what it is. It's a gathered knowledge of a lifetime, and also knowing what you don't know, which is a key thing, and when to talk to someone else about it. Whenever I do the roadshow, for example, I see myself almost as what we would call in the UK, a general practitioner. So you can field all these things, but sometimes you're triaging it. You're saying, well, I actually don't know how to read Arabic, but I do know this person who can, and I'll send them home with the address of someone that they can contact and find out about it. So you can't know everything, but I think the key to our business is knowing what you don't know and knowing who to speak to. So I think expertise is really what you're looking for, and the trained eye, and somebody who is properly qualified and a member of, hopefully, the Appraisers Association, I would say. I think I'm preaching to the converted here anyway, because most of you are appraisers or advisors, so you know all that. So I think on that note, unless any of you have anything you want to say in conclusion, I think we'll move. I'm hoping there's lots of questions.
I think the one I want to start with is about auction house fees and auction houses getting into retail. Because it feels to me, as a collector of things, that the auction houses seem to be doing things that are always better for them, but not always better for me as a buyer. And the fees are adding a huge amount to the hammer price.
I just
think
want to
Arlie-
say one thing, just because I found this one offensive. When one of the auction houses clipped on an extra 1% to the buyer's premium, they called it a convenience fee.
Yeah.
And I was like, convenient for whom? And now they just lop it all together. But initially, did they think we're stupid? I mean, I was very offended by that.
When we appraise things, we include buyer's premium and any additional fees in our fair market values. And so if those fair market values then go up because the auction fees are going up, it doesn't necessarily mean that the item itself is becoming more valuable. So I think in a way it can be a little bit misleading to have these really, really giant fees on top, and it can present an inaccurate picture of where the market is going. Retail, yeah, I think that it's understandable that buy it now is a part of, especially when it comes to the really large auction houses, the big international art brands. I mean, they don't even consider themselves auction houses really anymore. They consider themselves these international art brands, and they're owned by people who have a lot of luxury experience, and they're trying to access markets where buying stuff and having it quickly is, I suppose, really how they want to transact. So yeah, I think that in terms of having a buy it now, it all depends on what the person who's buying, whether or not they want to wait for something to come up at auction there or elsewhere, if they want to spend the time. I think that having a buy it now offering is a sensible thing to do. And I think as an auction house, you are servicing your clients to say, well, if you want to try and sell this more quickly, we can, or if we can put it out for buy it now, or we can wait for 6 months, and if it doesn't sell by now, well, then we can auction it. I think you're offering sellers that. But in terms of buyers, yeah, I mean, you are going to be continually squeezed, yeah.
Now that I'm no longer in the auction
I was going to
business,
say, I'm excited
I don't
to hear
feel
what
the need to defend it, and I can speak freely. And I'm old enough to remember when you just paid the hammer.
I was going to say, what was the buyer's premium when you started? There
wasn't one. Wow. That's how old I am.
It was 12%.
And when it came in originally, it was 10%. Yeah. And a lot of people said, or a lot of dealers said, that's when you should have gone after Christie's and Sotheby's, because they agreed to charge this. And I was at Phillips at the time, we felt sort of uncomfortable about it. But, well, that's for the packing that we do, it's for the cataloguing, but it never really felt real. And now we're at what, 27%? Which I find extraordinary. We get all the complaints about it.
Sometimes it's more. I mean, I think online I'm paying like 33% sometimes, because you have to pay the online convenience fee to the intermediary as well. So if you're bidding on Invaluable or something like that,
yeah,
they add on
live
their 3%,
auctioneer.
and that gets charged back to you too. It's quite a third, and even higher sometimes. It has got out of control. Yeah.
But I think what's happened is the balance has shifted now to the seller rather than the buyer, because it favors them. Because what's happening is that if you have a really special piece, the auction house is going to give you a slice of the upside. So they're giving you some of that buyer's premium back. And that's why if you work for a smaller auction house, you have to batch Sotheby's or Christie's, because otherwise it's not a level playing field. So it favors the seller now that they can push to get a really good deal, but the buyer is having to pay that much more. As far as the retail goes, I think there are issues there, because I remember being asked to get involved in a court case, and I wasn't prepared to do it, because a collector had bought a painting from a major dealer and then found out what he'd paid for it at auction. So I think the dealer had paid, let's say it was $50,000, and this guy had bought it for $350,000. He said, well, I felt as though I've been, had. And it's willing buyer, willing seller at the end of the day. But I think because people can now access, and there is transparency via ArtNet, we were talking about this earlier, Linda, ArtNet and AskArt, people can subscribe to these and they can see what things sold for at auction. So they're not going to be paying those gallery prices necessarily.
The only thing I can offer, and again, because I never want to be an apologist for the auction houses, the only thing I can offer is some context, which is the hardest thing that the auction houses do is source property for sale. That is where the competition is. And so, what has happened over time is that the seller's fees have all but gone away, and now we're in a second market economy where you have, third-party guarantors, and you have, in fact, an wholly independent market that is its own financial ecosystem now for powering the consignment part, because that's where the competition is. And again, having lived through God, I should tally how many times the buyer's premium was changed. And I remember including, I started my career at the dawn of the alleged collusion between Sotheby's and Christie's. And I just remember every time they would change the buyer's premium, everybody would clutch their pearls and this is it. And they've reached the ceiling. They never do. The truth of the matter is, and this is just the reality, is that as long as the object is great, the buyers are still going to come. And that's the lesson that the auction houses have learned. Now, what I think is interesting is, for instance, I don't know how many people here know that Phillips has gotten very creative this auction season with it's somewhere in between buy it now and an egregious buyer's premium, which is if you register your bid ahead of time, so in sort of an early action window, you can actually be eligible for a lower buyer's premium. So it's, for people who are registering at the last minute, they pay a higher rate. I think there's a lot of creative thinking that is built in around all these buyer's premium, all these fees. And they go back to, and again, because I do think you have to look at, I remember Ari Kopelman, who I feel like is still in this room somehow with us. For those of you who didn't know him, he was very, very involved. He sort of was the godfather of the winter show. I remember when I started working at Sotheby's, he looked at me and he said, I've looked at their books and they can't make money. What are you doing? And I was like, but it's fun, Ari. It's so much fun. The truth of the matter is that there aren't people making gazillions of dollars off of running an auction house. Just ask Alasdair. The overhead for what it takes to pay for specialists, to put out catalogs, even digital, there are a lot of, overhead fees associated. I remember they did a study once of like what it costs to move a teacup through the building. And it was a lot of money. Yeah.
As an appraiser, I appreciate the comments about the frustrations and limitations of using AI to get valuations. But I'm curious to hear from Laura about the practical applications of AI in the work that you're doing in the insurance industry.
So I should start by saying we're not looking at AI appraisals at all. We've had clients that have tried to submit those. We still want, there's so much market context that is critical, right? And provenance and condition, and we still want an appraiser looking at an item. So we are not there at all. We subscribe to different platforms like ArtNet and other ones that do market data and analytics. And in some cases, it's interesting because they have models that project values, right? But it's not something that we would ever rely on from an insurance perspective. I think some of it is just, helpful market context, really. We would never actually take one of those values and use them for an appraisal. So, I think like all businesses, we're looking at different use cases for AI from an efficiency standpoint. Our business is still very much who is the client, what type of collection is it, how is it protected and maintained? And that is still very much a person, an underwriter that's doing that analysis. So we'll see, what happens with the future, but we have a team in-house, underwriters with extensive experience that really dig into the client, the collection, and having that, person that's doing that oversight, I think is a really critical component. And it's so much expertise, right? That something that we've been talking about is that is not always there with AI. It's not always correct. Everyone has typed something into ChatGPT and that authoritative response comes back and it's completely wrong. So yeah, I think every industry is evolving, but right now we are very much still, underwriters that are looking at risks.
Let's say, for instance, you have a client, he bought an item from an auction many years ago, they had it appraised and something happened, and they need the insurance to intervene. Like, if there is a big clash between or difference between the purchase price and the new appraisal, what do you do and how do you assess the credibility of the appraising company? And what do you recommend new collectors, let's say, who are new to this space, to look into, like choosing or picking the right appraisal company?
Yeah, so to your first question, the benefit of itemizing something on a policy is that we are agreeing to that value up front. So CHUBB, we are agreeing to that value. The client's providing us the value. It's itemized on the policy. So if there is a loss, that is how the client is going to be compensated. So we're basically settling the loss up front. Now, CHUBB and some other companies in the space, we recognize that, markets fluctuate. Some markets can spike. We offer coverage enhancement on top of that. So if the value has gone up and the appraisal doesn't reflect that, there is a certain percentage on top that the client might be eligible for. Itemizing it, you know what's there. Certain segments obviously can change rapidly. Markets might go down. But even if the item value in the current market is less than what's on the policy, you're still going to get what is on the policy. If you have items insured under a blanket, that's basically an aggregate limit. It's usually used for lower value pieces. So you might have a high volume, low individual value collection, and you say, collectively it's all worth $100,000. I'm going to put that value on this collection. And then in the event of a loss, an appraisal is done at that point to determine what exactly is the current market value. And then that's how the client is compensated in that moment. So you don't know exactly what you're going to get when it's a blanket, but itemized, you get that benefit. And then your second question, I think, was for collectors looking at, so we always direct our clients to a member of one of the three main appraisal organizations. So the AAA, ISA, ASA. And then obviously, they all have different credential levels. I think a certified member of the AAA is maybe one of the highest educational standards. So we always direct clients to those individuals. And then certainly you want to make sure that the item being appraised, that it's a specialist that actually is focused on that area that's doing the appraisal.
Thank you so much for coming today. I hope you found it as enjoyable as I did. Thank you.